Hi and welcome back to Bike Speeds. This week we're going to service this Specialized Pitch Sport hybrid bike. Had a manner of problems when it came in. The headset was a little bit grimy, the forks were seized, the chain was worn out, the tyres were worn, and we had this problem here with the stick or debris in this rear rotor here, quite dangerous, so we need to also make sure that the bike is safe along with this service. So this is very, very important to get this sorted out. I also noticed in between the pads was this little piece of debris here. This was my first thing to do, was to pull this debris out of there so that we can actually get to the pads to clean them. And you can see here the forks have seized solid. So we're going to service these forks along the way and make sure that they're working as well. And you can see the chain was at 0.75 stretch. This is the perfect time now to replace this chain. So we'll also take this one off and replace it with a brand new chain, which is the perfect time to do that with a service. So first of all, we're going to strip the bike down. So the first thing for me to do is to take off that worn and tired chain. We'll discard that, ready for a new one. Off comes the front wheel, making sure the discs come out along with the rear wheel, making sure that all comes out nicely. And then with the rear wheel, I'm going to remove the cassette. Wasn't too bad. You can see how shiny the number one ring is there, but there was some grime beginning to build up in the lower gearing there. You can see that there's a little bit of grime, so we're going to put that through the ultrasonic cleaner and really clean that up and make that nice before it goes back on the bike. Just going to knock the tail off of this rear derailleur cable. Hopefully we'll be able to reuse that without replacing it. It was shifting okay when it came in, but we do want to clean up this rear derailleur. You can see a little bit of grime and debris, there's a little bit of corrosion on that, a bit of grease build up on the jockey wheels, and it all needs oiling and lubricating. So we take that off the bike to do that. So that's why I removed that rear derailleur cable. Same with the front. We're going to actually remove this one off of the bike as well. That comes off the frame, and we can also clean that one up. This one, actually, you notice, is actually quite dry, a little bit of corrosion here and there, but you can see that it's not got a wet look to it. It's very dry and definitely needs lubricating. Same with the pedals and chain set. We're going to remove those so that we can clean up the threads of the pedals, clean up the chain set, make sure everything's right. Now, we were quite lucky with this one in that the bottom bracket was actually at the sweet spot. It was a very nice flowing bottom bracket with no noise. The bearings had worn in but weren't worn out, so it was spinning quite freely and quite nicely. So the bottom bracket on this one was absolutely fine. So we've serviced the rest of the bike and left that. Maybe next time or the time after that may need attention, but today it was okay. Remove the rear brake pads out, they slide now. We're going to actually clean those up as well. But the front one, I often mention in other videos about this pivot pin that runs through the bearings seizing up and how we lubricate the threads on this with every service. In this case, this was at the point where I could not get it undone. It had seized well into the caliper. I was very fortunate that I could actually get a saw blade on this without actually damaging or touching any of the caliper or the mounts or anything else. So I was able to put a groove into that Allen head, and fortunately for me rather, I was able to remove that with the turn of a screwdriver. So we'll actually discard that pin now. We'll actually replace that with a brand new one, but for the time being we need to get those pads out, and they come out successfully. Now you can see those front pads, how infused they are with debris. They've got that shine to them, a little bit of oil impregnation there, not very good at all. They create squealing and also poor braking, so we'll clean those up and make sure that they're absolutely ready to go when they go back on the bike. Next up, I'm going to start removing the jockey wheels and cages etc. from the rear derailleur. What I'm doing here effectively is preparing my items to go through the ultrasonic cleaner. So you can see we're putting the chain set, the derailleur, the front derailleur, and various components such as the jockey wheels are going through the ultrasonic cleaner, and they'll be cleaned for around about 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will wash each of the components down that we've put through there to get the degreaser off of them, and then each of these components is then dried off before we begin the lubricating process. So you can see there I'm using one of our detailing brushes. They're nice because you can tuck right into the parts that you can't necessarily get to with a rag or your fingers, so we always use a detailing brush when washing these off. And then once dry, we can begin the lubrication process. Now with these jockey wheels, they don't have bearings in the center. they have that central bushing in the center. So we're going to put a little bit of our premium grease around that bush there, so that slides into the jockey wheel and is lubricated when it goes back together. And now that's what we're going to do, is put the derailleur back together. So I'm using a little bit of our thread locker there on the axles for the jockey wheels, and then we will pop those together. And once they are together, they won't come undone with a little bit of that thread locker on there. They should be good to go for many miles without any issues. So once that's done, the next stage is to sort out this little problem here that I have with the adjusters on this derailleur. Now, often I wouldn't take these out. They actually should be set and forget really when the bike is produced new and set up, but these had corroded quite badly, so I did actually elect to take those out, give those a little bit of a brush down on the bench, and you can see there that they actually came up quite nicely. The corrosion disappeared from the threads, which means that they're not going to stick and bind and then have no adjustment whatsoever. I wanted those to actually adjust nicely once the bike went back together and also present nicely. So I'm just going to pop a little bit of general purpose grease in those threads. That will actually stop them corroding into the body itself, and so that we can do our adjustments as and when we need to without that corrosion, and it just presents a little bit nicer. And you can see there the rust is now gone, so much better than it was when it came in. Same with the thumb adjuster. You can see there that white powdering, that's actually corrosion, so we've cleaned that off with a brass brush there, and then I'm also going to lubricate that. So I'm putting a little bit of general purpose grease where the plastic of the thumb adjuster turns on that adjuster inside, and then I'm actually going to use a little bit of our anti-seize grease on the threads for the thumb adjuster, because thumb adjusters aren't a set and forget. You'll often need to just do fine-tuning adjustments to your derailleurs, so we want to make sure that one will continue to turn moving forwards and won't actually seize on the bike. Using a little bit of our premium grease here on the spring to the derailleur. They are greased from the factory. That is the correct grease to use on those, and it will just stop those rusting and also enable them to actuate nicely. Springs do coil on themselves as they actuate, so it's nice to lubricate those. And then I'm using our general purpose oil on the pivot points of both derailleurs to make sure that everything is running smoothly once it's back on the bike, and that it will change gear nicely once it is set up. Also, very common to be forgotten is the skewers. General purpose oil on the lever there, they often seize up. The shaft here will often seize into the wheel. I've had those where I've had to extract them, and then also the ends often seize, so I'm using our anti-seize grease on the threads where the end goes on there. Everything there is now correctly lubricated, and now I'm going to deal with this grease infused pad. So first of all, a brass bristled brush to clean off that surface. That's now looking really good. And I'm just going to give this a little skim on our grinding wheel. Not only will that put a little bit of heat in to get rid of that impregnation, but you can see there, these are the same pads that came out of that bike. You can see the one on the left we haven't done yet, how that is so much different to the one on the right. No need to discard them, they just need cleaning up appropriately, and they're ready to go. Now we need to remove this big old twig from the wheel there. You can see that was quite dangerous in itself. And then I'm going to also just sand down the discs. This will just take any of those scores away. These can often cause squealing, a bit like an old record, vinyl record with all the little lines in it. Similar process here, it can squeal away, but by just giving that little sand down, it smooths any of those rough edges and makes it nice and smooth so that it breaks correctly without that squealing. And I'm just using a little bit of wire wool just to clean that surface rust, them odd little bits of rust that were on that disc, and you can see there, it just presents nicely. All that rust is gone, it just stops it from spreading too quickly, and everything there is right. Now I'm using our detailing brush again on the wheel, so I'm just washing this wheel down. By doing it with a detailing brush, not only do I get to clean up the wheel, but it's sort of a tactile way of checking the wheel at the same time. So I can just check the spokes, make sure everything in the center is right, make sure all the rim is okay, there's no damage to it, no dents, no cracks. And once I'm happy with that, I can put the cassette back on the bike. So general purpose grease there, and on goes the cassette. All these greases, you see we use 5 different syringe greases. They are all available on our website, so please do check that out. We always pop a link to the website in the description below, and it's a great way of supporting our channel and helping us to grow the channel along the way. So do check out the website and see if there's anything that may help you with your next service. Now we are putting new tyres on this bike. The customer asked us to put new tyres on, so we're actually replacing like for like. So off goes the old tyre, in comes the brand new tyre. I'm lining up the manufacturer's logo with the valve, in goes the inner tube, make sure everything there is nice, and then we can just start working that tyre around. No need to use levers to get it back on. Centralise the tyre and it should pop on nicely, and then we can inflate that to the correct pressure before that goes back on the bike. So that wheel is now ready to go back on, cassette clean, disc sanded and cleaned and made sure it's all okay, tyres replaced, everything with the wheels is perfect and spot on. Now I'm going to turn my attention to these Suntour forks. These are sprung forks, so we're going to actually service these and see if we can actually get them operating again. You saw in the before shots that they were absolutely seized solid, no movement whatsoever, and also the headset bearings were a little bit iffy on this bike, are a little bit tight, so we're going to also check those out as we go. So initially we're just using a little mallet there. We've got no movement in the head at all. You can see there's quite a bit of rust on the steerer tube, so we're just going to put a little bit of penetrant oil into there and allow that to soak in for a period of time before giving it another knock, and thankfully it all began to come apart. So once they're off, we can begin our servicing. So out come the forks, they're now off the bike. It's far easier to do these on the bench than on the bike. You can see the headset bearings themselves aren't actually too bad. They're not terrible with corrosion, but they've got thickening of grease, which is what's making them not run so smoothly. So we're going to put those through the ultrasonic cleaner, clean up the cups for the bearings as well before we start on the forks, but this will just make everything there nice for the bearings. Nothing wrong with those cups at all, in fact very, very little wear. So first thing for me to do is to remove the lower body of the forks, so we just need to undo the bolts that hold those on, and obviously these were seized. You can see the corrosion there. We had to give those a fair old tap to get them apart, but once they do come apart we can begin cleaning everything up, putting new seals in, new sliders, lubricating everything, and these should be okay once they're done. So out comes the main spring. You can see how brown and grimy that was. You can see on this leg here how there's a lot of grime and dirt, and there's grease there, but it's very, very grimy. This was very gritty inside, so it definitely needs new seals. And you can see that first preloader there, that spring was also very grimy, so they all go in the ultrasonic cleaner as well. Everything there will run through, and then I will work on these legs. Now these are never going to come up perfectly, but these are a very, very entry level fork. They aren't filled with oil, so they are only a sprung fork, so there is no harm in cleaning them up in this manner. As long as they're working afterwards, they should be absolutely fine, because it's not so essential for these stanchions to be spotlessly clean and like a mirror finish. It's not quite so important on a fork of this nature, so cleaning it up, everything will be fine once it's back together. You can see here a little bit of corrosion on the steerer tube, so I'm going to just do a little bit of wet and drying there to clean that off, and you can see that's now absolutely fine to go back together. And then we have already actually removed the seals out of this, but there are these sliders inside here, and on these lower level forks these tend to wear, which gives you that forward and backward rocking when you're braking, that sensation of the forks rocking on themselves. So we'll clean those out, put in new ones, new seals in the top of these legs, and everything there should be fine once it goes back together. Again, these nylon brushes are available on our website. Great brush there for cleaning these out, and you can see there the degreaser that we're using, how that is very, very grimy, so well worth cleaning these up. And now we can begin to put them together. So the initial spring in there, we're just greasing the shaft that it goes onto. I'm going to grease all of that heavily. It isn't easy to redo, so we want everything well coated. Make sure the spring is nicely lubricated so that everything there will run smoothly inside when it's actuating. So on goes that spring now. So that's the first part of this jigsaw puzzle to put together, along with this little retaining washer here, little rubber washer, and then a little bit of grease below that. Obviously if I put that on first, that little washer would have wiped that straight off, so that's why I put that on second. And then we've got that to go into the leg, so you can see it has an Allen head in the top of that, and then the little lower retainer goes on to the bottom of that leg there, so that's good. And even this spring, if you look how that came up in comparison with how it started, it was in a very sorry state. So plenty of our general purpose grease on the leg there onto the spring to make sure that that's all nicely lubricated when it goes back in, and then that can go into the leg and that will be the lubrication for that. And on goes the adjuster into the top of the forks. In go the sliders to the bottom legs now, so that's 1 and then 2. These are brand new ones. And then we put the seals into the forks. I put these in dry. They are supposed to be a friction fit, so we pop those in dry. No grease on those. You often see where they pop back out, and it was because they were lubricated being put in, and that's not actually the correct way they should be done. They should be put in dry as we're doing here. So in goes the second one. Give that a little tap in, and everything there is now ready for lubricating and putting together. So first thing for me to do is our general purpose grease inside the leg. Obviously we want that below the seal now, so that when the stanchions and top of the forks go in, that will be lubricated from the inside. And we're just going to put a little bit of grease onto these legs as well. This is a shock absorber type of damper on that side, so we just want to make sure that will run smoothly as well. And then these can now go back together. So they go back together. We have a little bolt here that's a little bit tricky to get in, so we just line that up before popping it together, and then those bolts can go on the bottom, and that's the service complete there on the forks, and they're now ready to go back on the bike. So very time consuming, quite a fiddly thing to do, but that is how we do the fork service on a fork of this nature. And now we're going to pop on the headset bearings, which are the original ones, gone through the ultrasonic cleaner with fresh premium grease on those, and they will operate very, very nicely once they go back on the bike. Again, we're lubricating the top race there, in go the bearings, second row of grease there before we put the forks together. Spacers go on, and then we can put the forks back on the bike. They slide in nicely, and the spacers slide on and off with ease now that we've wet and dried the steerer tube. And then we can pop the stem onto the bike, and then obviously our pre-tension preloader for the headset bearing goes in next, so we just adjust that in to get the preload of the bearing and give the stem a little tighten, and we'll square that up once it's back on the ground and make sure everything there is adjusted as it needs to be. Lastly, I put the brake back on, which obviously had to come off for the forks so that I could service them. And we are now ready for the wash down before we completely put the bike back together. So we're just going to wash this frame down. This wasn't a detailing service, so we're just going to clean this one up. I'm starting there with a snow foam pre-spray to start softening all the debris. We're using a big softy brush there. This is our nice thickly populated nylon brush, very, very smooth, doesn't scratch the paintwork, gets all the grime off that is there. This bike was covered in a really thick grease that you can't really see, but there was a film over the entire bike. That film was mostly down to the chainstay and the rear triangle from the chain. It took some working to loosen up. That's fairly common on white bikes, as they show up the dirt much more than other colours. We'll also then dry this off with a microfiber towel. Now the beauty of the microfiber towels is they really lift off that water and debris without scratching the bike, without spoiling the bike in any way, and I can just work that through and get everything nice and dry. A little bit of general purpose grease on the bottom bracket, on the splines for the chain set, and then we'll just tighten those up and we can torque those up once it's all together. So we're torquing these up to the manufacturer's specifications. Now I usually go through the bike at the end of a service with a torque wrench and make sure everything's right, but with the bottom bracket area and the front chain rings, I do like to have everything torqued before I do my adjustments, because the front derailleur operates on a left and right motion, and if that chain set is not sitting in its final position, you can pull that in just another 0.5 millimeter by torquing it up, and then obviously it would be in the wrong position for the front derailleur. So that's why I like to torque everything up as I go with the bottom bracket area. So on go the pedals, I put a little bit of our anti-seize grease on those. Pedals have to come on and off throughout the life of a bike, and I've seen those where they're absolutely rock solid, so we don't want that to happen. So I lubricate those and torque those up correctly. On goes the front derailleur, so we're using the original cable here. There's no need to replace that, it was shifting nicely before, and everything there is now as it needs to be and torqued up. So torquing it up before we put the chain on, and then we can do our adjustments there. On goes the rear derailleur. That's going to be much easier to adjust now that I've removed the corrosion from the thumb adjuster and the high and low screws. And then we'll put a new tail end on that cable, so that we obviously knocked off to get the derailleur off. And this is the brand new pivot that we were talking about that had failed on the original bike, so I'm using our anti-seize grease on the threads to try and avoid that happening again. And then the tiniest amount of anti-seize grease on the back of the pads. When they're metal pads like these and the piston itself is a lower spec metal piston, you can get corrosion formed between the two. So you can see I've put the tiniest amount, spread it so that you can avoid the corrosion between the piston and the pads, and then in goes that pivot pin. Same with the front, in goes the pads, and then we're putting that brand new pivot pin into the front one here, because obviously the original one was damaged when we removed it, but thankfully we did get it removed. On goes the wheels with those lovely new tyres. I'm making sure not to over tighten those quick release skewers, so that combined with the grease they should come out an awful lot easier in the future. And then for me, the heartbeat of a bike is the chain. As I put the chain on, I know I'm bringing the bike back to life. This is one of our silver chains. They always present nicely. They're not like the budget chains you can get that are all black at this gearing. 6, 7, 8 speed gearing. Often the chain is the spoil sport of the chain set, so we've got our nice silver chain on there. And just one of the other things for the customer was the luxury of new handlebar grips. The ones on it originally were very worn out and let the bike down. So to make sure the new ones go on easily and stay securely on, I use hairspray. That's a little trick that's always worked well for me. It can be sticky though, so I make sure to wipe the bars down after. And lastly, on goes the new bar end, so a nice front end refresh. As you can see, the gears shift nicely. The old cables work absolutely fine on both the front and rear. That triple front has a nice positive shift as well, so I'm happy with all the gears and the adjustments. Then the brakes. They are now solid, despite the poor condition that they arrived in. We cleaned them up nicely and they don't require any new parts. And also we've now got these forks that are no longer seized, so the customer's now got a little bit of suspension back in the bike, so it will be a very comfortable ride. All we need to do now is to check the bike with the torque wrench. Obviously we've had a lot of this apart to do the work, so we want to make sure that the brakes are correct and not going to move around, that the stem is at its correct adjustment, and also torque so that we don't have risk of the handlebars turning. And obviously we've had all the brakes off, so we don't want those calipers to work loose. We need to check those. Same with the rear, so we go through, we have a checklist and a check sheet that we make sure that we've done everything and that nothing is missed. Pedals, obviously we've had those off to lubricate the threads, but they do have a set torque, so we want to make sure that they're correct and not over tightened. Saddles often work loose, but in this instance actually it wasn't too bad. Just need to square up the rear reflector, which we couldn't get to the bolts for that. And then also the quick release for the saddle was a little bit off, so I just tidied that up. And then the rear derailleur, as we move front to back, we just want to make sure that the derailleur is all okay, and that pinch bolt, again, because it's one of the components that we took off the bike. And then just one of the other things I generally do is to check the accessory bolts to make sure that they still turn and rotate. Again, they can fail and seize, and if you just turn them even once a year with your service, you know that they're going to actually not seize long term. So bike is looking great. Everything on it is now working. All the problems are ironed out. It's absolutely ready to go with those lovely forks that are now working. All the new tyres. This bike will ride like a dream. So I do hope you've enjoyed this video. Please do like and subscribe. We'll see you again soon. Bye for now.